Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this short session. Tim Baker's my name. I'm going to spend a short time with you this morning, and I just simply wanted to talk about managing expectations in the workplace, which I think is an interesting topic. I think it's a lot more complex than we'd like to think, and there's a whole lot of potential barriers that get in the way for that. And I know many leaders get very frustrated, and they talk to me about, they've talked about an expectation. People aren't following through on it, and they're pretty much exasperated about how they do that. So I wanted to just sort of put that in perspective today, and I think give you some sense of how you might do that more effectively. So let me share my screen to start with, and then we'll launch into the presentation. So this material comes from my book, my latest book, in fact, which is Mastering Feedback, a practical guide for better leadership conversations. And I would argue that there are 7 keys to managing expectations more effectively. And what I'm going to do is talk about those and give you a sense of what they are. And then you can obviously think about how you're traveling against each of those expectations. So let's launch into it. Just for those of you who don't know, Tim Baker and I obviously run keynote addresses. I give keynote addresses. I run workshops. I'm an author of 13 books, and you can see that I'm also an executive coach and still play rugby in the Golden Oldies competition in Brisbane. So there's a few things I do, keeps me out of trouble. So let's just launch into the topic proper today. And I think it's fair to say that one of the key questions that you might be asking yourself is, why is it so difficult to communicate my expectations to my team members? Why is it so challenging for people to follow through on those things? It's a good question. So, and what I'd like to do is address that today. And so what I wanted to do is just give you a sense of some of the research around the whole notion of expectations and feedback. I'd like to talk about the power and the value of the normal catch-up, which I think is extremely important. Some people call it a check-in. I prefer to call it a catch-up. I think a check-in implies that you are checking in, which implies that maybe people can't be trusted. And at the end of this presentation, I've got a special offer for those of you who would like to take advantage of that. All right, so let's look at this to start with. Now, the key thing is there are a few things that are more important as a manager than being able to communicate your expectations effectively. So obviously, if a manager is not setting expectations and communicating those, then pretty much anything goes, doesn't it? So it is fundamental to being a good leader is to be clear in your expectations and to clearly communicate those expectations, to remove roadblocks to those expectations wherever possible, and also to give feedback so that people know how they're going against those expectations. So there are quite a few things that need to be considered. Now, here's some research that I think is a little disturbing when you look at it. And let me just sort of give you a sense of what we're hearing back from various surveys. 69% of managers report that they feel uncomfortable communicating expectations to team members. Now, obviously, if almost 70% of people feel uncomfortable communicating expectations to team members, then it's probably likely that they're not doing it to the extent that they probably should. So obviously, if you've got a situation where people don't feel comfortable doing that, you might say, well, why wouldn't people feel comfortable sharing or expressing their own expectations? There's probably myriad reasons for that. I mean, one of the reasons for that could be that the manager themselves isn't clear about their expectations, or it could be that the manager feels uncomfortable about what they might perceive to be imposing their expectations on their team members. It might be that they just don't think it's their job There's a whole range of possibilities around that. So 37% of those also express discomfort giving direct feedback about people's performance. So not only do people overall feel uncomfortable about communicating expectations, there might be another reason that people just think that people should know what those things are and why it's a bit demeaning of me to have to communicate those on a regular basis. But I think worse still, of that 69%, 37% say that, you know, they have trouble giving direct feedback to people about their performance. Now, it may well be that they have trouble giving direct feedback about performance for the simple reason that they haven't made absolutely crystal clear what those expectations are. So you see, it's an interesting issue, isn't it? And so that's why I'm running a session on this, because I know that it is a major issue for lots of organisations and managers. So what I want to do now is cover the 7 questions that are critical for managing expectations. And what I'd like you to do is, as I go through these 7 questions, I'd like you to think about whether or not you have fulfilled this question, or you can respond to it in a positive way. Because the argument is, if any of these questions you can't answer in the affirmative, it would probably suggest that you're not managing expectations to the extent that you probably could. So I'm going to go through them, not too quickly, but just give you enough time to absorb them. And in your mind, think, well, am I doing that or am I not doing that? So the very first and most fundamental question that a leader could ask is, what are my expectations as a leader? Now, obviously, if you're not crystal clear about what your expectations as a leader are, then it's highly likely that nobody in your team will be clear about it either. So clearly, the leader needs to be well aware of those. And I think in a lot of cases, leaders do have some thresholds around expectations, but I think you need to think very carefully about that. So, because your expectations will guide and inform what goes on in your team. And clearly, if you don't have clear expectations, then anything goes, and you create what we might call an unsafe, a psychologically unsafe working environment. In other words, people aren't sure of what's expected of them. And that is not good for performance or morale or a whole range of other factors. So the first thing you've got to do is work out what your expectations are. Now, do you need expectations about everything? Well, maybe not necessarily, but you certainly need a series of expectations around the key things that you do. The second thing you need to do is you have to communicate those expectations to your team. Now, you might say, well, I've done that. I've had a team meeting and I've communicated those expectations. But this is something that is ongoing. It never ends. So you've got to communicate this one-on-one. You've got to communicate this in a team. You've got to communicate it over and over again. And when you're giving feedback, you're communicating your expectations as well. So this is an ongoing piece of work. It's not just a one-off. You actually need to be doing this on a regular basis. 3, now, just because you've communicated your expectations doesn't necessarily mean that the team members understand what those expectations are or how it relates to the work that they do. So it's really, really important. It's really important that you make sure that people understand the relevance of those expectations. In other words, why are they in place? You know, if people don't understand the why you have that expectation, then they're less likely to respect it. That is the expectation. So explain the why, because don't assume that people understand the why. It's important that you explain it as well. And then once you've done that, it's not the end of the road. We've still got 4 more questions to respond to. Now, the other point there is, just because your team members understand your expectations, it doesn't necessarily mean that they accept them. So they might think I understand what you're trying to do, but I don't agree with it, right? So that's that kind of thing. So obviously, if someone doesn't agree with your expectations, they're not likely to follow through on that, are they? So accepting them is one thing. Now, often people will nod dutifully, but they don't really accept those expectations. So it's very, very important that you very much talk to people about the expectations, how it impacts on their work, and pretty much sell the expectation to the individual so that they understand why this expectation is what it is. Really, really important. So if I've done those 4, surely that's it. No, there's more. The next step is, and the next question really for you to think about is, are my team members committed to meeting those expectations? Now, all of us are busy. All of us have got too much to do and too little time to do it in. So we're all that way. And there's not a person that I know in any working environment across 21 industries who's just sitting there bored because they don't know what to do next. We're all too busy. So in other words, if you share your expectations with team members and they understand them and they accept them, it doesn't necessarily mean that they'll commit to them. In other words, they've got other things to do as well. And so it might well be that your expectation is on the bottom of the priority list in their mind. So here's a very good question that you can ask your team members, and I strongly urge you give this a go. You ask people, you say to people simply, can I get your commitment that you'll get this report done by the close of business today? Now, that's not a disrespectful question. It's something that's your expectation. You've shared it with the other person and you're waiting for a nod or a grunt or a yes. Now, if you get a nod or a grunt or a yes, then that person at least is verbally committed to meeting that expectation. And there's a reasonable chance, because they're verbally committed to it, that they're likely to follow through on it. But if you don't ask that question, you'll walk away assuming that that person's committed to that expectation when in fact they're not. And then you might find that you're bitterly disappointed by the close of business today when that report is not on your desk. So by all means, it's very reasonable for you to ask people, can I get your commitment to meet this expectation? It is very reasonable to ask that question, and I think you should. Question 6, do my team members know how they're performing against those expectations? Now, this is important. This is what feedback's all about. So obviously, if you're not giving people regular feedback, how will they know that they're meeting your expectations? So obviously, if they're exceeding expectations, that's positive feedback. And if they're not meeting a minimum acceptable standard of performance, then that is what we might call constructive feedback. But people need to know where the line in the sand is, and you as a leader are responsible for letting them know. So please get good at giving feedback. As you know, the whole book is about feedback, and I go into great detail about those things, including managing expectations. But if you're not giving people feedback, then they're going to make the assumption that your expectations aren't terribly valuable, because the fact that you haven't pulled people up when they're doing it well or not so well probably indicates that your expectations are a bit fluffy and they're not really worthwhile worrying about. So by virtue of giving people feedback, you're making it clear that that's important. Number 7 on the list, and this is one important one as well, the last one. Am I supporting my team members to achieve those expectations? Now, that could be training and development. It could well be that you are removing organisational roadblocks. Whatever it might be, you've got to make it easy for people to follow through and to meet those expectations. So your job as a leader is to remove those roadblocks. So, for example, if there's someone in another team that's not getting information to one of your team members in a timely fashion, which means that their work is hamstrung because they can't do what they need to do, then a roadblock is obviously, the delay in getting that information to your team member. This might be something that you can deal with to help your team member to get that information in a timely manner. So that would be a roadblock that you could remove. So you can see that there are 7 key questions around this that are critically important. And I hope with this framework that I've given you, it gives you some sort of insight into where you could probably spend a little bit more energy in terms of managing your expectations. Okay. Now, just before we wrap up today, I just wanted to let you know, and I'm sure some of the loyal supporters here would be aware of this, but next week I've got a really interesting session, and we're going to change tack a little bit and talk about the 8 characteristics of high-performing teams. Now, this comes from my book, Winning Teams, and I really want to touch on these 8 characteristics. The good news for you is that when I share this with you next week, you will be able to pretty much look at your team and make some clear evaluations around whether your team are meeting these 8 characteristics. And if not, where should I be starting? So please join me next week. Now, every Friday at this time, I have a 30-minute short, sharp webinar. I'd like to think they're very practical. It gives you an opportunity to look at a topic that might improve your ability to lead other people. And you might wonder where the link is. If you look at the bottom of the page there, you'll be getting a copy of the slides and the recording, and then you'll be able to click on that link and it'll take you into that webinar as such, and you'll be just as you did for today. So the other thing I suggested to you at the outset of this is I have a special offer for you, and I do, that you can get my book, Mastering Feedback, at half price. The book, of course, does talk about expectations. It also talks about remote feedback. It talks about interesting topics around a whole range of things, but it's essentially about improving your ability to give people feedback. How do you give difficult feedback and not get people defensive about it? Now, if you have a look on Amazon, you'll find that the book is selling for about $25. And so what I'm suggesting to you is that if you send me an email by the close of business today, I will give you the book for $12.50 plus postage. So you'll get it at half price. And of course, I'll post it out to you, or I'll sign it for you, and you'll have your book fairly quickly. But the catch is that you've got to get an email to me by the close of business today. I've only got limited copies in my office, and I'll get those out to you ASAP. So, folks, that's it from me. I'll just stop sharing for a moment, and I just wanted to thank you all for your time. And appreciate you getting involved today, and love to see you next week as well. But I think the key message out of today is that if you're not managing expectations in your team, you're doing your team a disservice and yourself. So it's really important to really spend some time getting this right, because if you think about a leader that you have been led by previously, and you think about a good leader that you've been led by previously, I'll guarantee that one of the things that they did very effectively is that they let you know exactly where you stood in terms of their expectations of you and of the work that you do. So it's a really good exercise to get into. And of course, again, if I asked you to talk about a leader that perhaps you didn't respect as much, I would probably suggest to you that the problem that they exhibiting there is that they had enormous trouble, clarifying expectations, if you like. So it's a really important topic to look at. So, folks, that's it from me. Thank you for your participation. I've enjoyed working with you today. And what we'll do is hopefully we can see you next week. And as I said, if you'd like a copy of the book, just send me an email. Thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful weekend, and let's catch up again sometime or later next week. Thanks, everyone. All the best. Thank you, and goodbye.